Hello out there, my name is G-Vance and welcome back to the channel, and it is time for a review of the new Kid Cudi album, INSANO. The official ninth studio album by the Moon Man himself, an album that we were actually supposed to get back in October, but ended up being delayed by Cudi himself after he dropped one of the most craziest and just strangest preview of all time, which basically caused the internet to bully him the way they did when they saw that ugly Sonic design. And if you were fortunate enough to see that preview before it got deleted by Cudi on Twitter, then yeah, it makes sense. All jokes aside, I would say that despite a few minor hiccups here and there in Kid Cudi's discography, he honestly has had some pretty decent success in his maybe like at this point over 2 decades of being an MC. You know, even in recent years, we got some of Cudi's best work with not only in 2018 with him dropping a nearly perfect joint album with Kanye called Kids See Ghosts, but also back in 2020, he made the third installment to the Man of the Moon series, which was another really great installment for some of his better work, in my opinion. Back in 2022, however, we got Cudi's Intergalactic album, which was basically a soundtrack to Cudi's Netflix animated series of the same name. And honestly, you know, even though it was cool to see Cudi sort of jump in a different dimension, both musically and career-wise, for me, Intergalactic just sort of like failed to recapture the magic of what made Cudi such a great artist, despite the actual like animated series itself being pretty good, both visually and story-wise. So you would think that after delaying this album, we would at least get a decent Cudi record, but honestly, it just ends up being a very mixed bag where even though I found myself enjoying quite a few selection of tracks on this record, there was just many moments where it was just very uninspiring, to say the least. I would say we had a pretty decent start with the first track, Often I Have These Dreams. You know, it's always really cool to see DJ Drama on here. It's always really fun to hear DJ Drama, you know, sort of hyping an album up, who we actually hear narrate a majority of the record. But then, you know, we get Keep Bouncing and Get Off Me with Travis Scott. You know, two tracks that just, you know, both of them just having just a lot of noise in my opinion, like nothing really too special about it. And Get Off Me just sounds like a throwaway Travis Scott song that Cudi decided to use. Like it just really wasn't a really like great start. Like I wouldn't say even an okay start, but you know, it's just the start that we got, and it honestly sort of like paved the way to how I felt about this entire record. Just complete like bland and once again uninspiring, unfortunately. However, things do start picking up a bit with the next track, Most Ain't Dennis, which despite starting off with the line acting like my poo don't stink, I think it's one of the tracks that has a really good Cudi verse, a really good Cudi flow, which is how I would describe a lot of the tracks that I liked on here. Like, despite having really questionable, laughable, freaking cringe-worthy lyrics, I think that a lot of it had some pretty decent to okay lyrics and just some pretty like impressive flow as well. So yeah, that's how I feel about Most Ain't Dennis, which later leads to the next track, Wow, with A$AP Rocky, which not only has a really great Cudi hook, but it has a pretty great verse from A$AP Rocky as well, you know. And of course, it is a new A$AP Rocky verse. It's something that, you know, I'm always excited to hear, especially, you know, considering that it's been a minute since this man has dropped an album, and at this point, I'm just happy with whatever new like A$AP Rocky, like anything that I get these days. After that, we get the track Electrowave Baby, which admittedly was a track I wasn't really in love with when I first heard this record, but after hearing the record a few more times, it was a track that I ended up really appreciating, only because it is the one of two tracks that has the most unique production on it, where it sort of stands out in a very good way. So it's something I appreciate from this album, considering that, you know, a lot of the production, although it may be pretty good and just pretty impressive at the same time, a lot of it just sort of sounds the same. And so that's why Electrowave Baby is a really like great standing out track for me. However, we do take a few steps back, unfortunately, with the next two tracks, Tale of a Night and Cut Life. Two tracks that sound incredibly similar to each other, both containing the most generic and basic, lyricism and production. And they both just seemed a bit too dragged out, and neither of these tracks really add anything new or exciting to the overall record's vibe. The next track, Too Damn High with Lil Yachty, is a very interesting experience for me, because even though I found myself genuinely enjoying the hook that Cudi provided on here, one of the catchiest hooks on here again, it's Yachty's verse that just makes me laugh a lot. And it's not even because I think Yachty versus bad or that Yachty himself is a bad artist. It's just because it genuinely sounds like Yachty didn't want to be in this album in the first place, but he literally had a gun pointed to him by Kid Cudi himself and was basically forcing him to be on the track. So Yachty, under all that pressure, was coming up with the most random ass verse at the top of his head and was hoping that it would be acceptable for Cudi on this track. So yeah, I just find it very funny just imagining, Yachty in the studio just sort of shaking in his boots and everything, and eyes wide open because Cudi is like right behind him with a literal gun to his head. And so, despite me liking the overall vibe and just the overall sort of like hook on this track, Yachty's verse just sort of takes away any kind of excitement I had for it, because I just found myself just laughing every time Yachty's verse came up. Now, the next track, Get You Gone, is a track that I can't even begin to try and talk about on this video, just because it genuinely is the most shortest and forgettable track on this entire record. And every time I hear it, there's just never anything that catches my attention. I just always end up zoning out when this track comes on. It literally is so forgettable. I have heard this album 3 times and I never ever remember what happens in the song, how it sounds like. It's just genuinely so forgettable that I don't think it's even worth acknowledging. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. So now we've reached the midpoint of the album with the track At the Party, which has a feature with Pharrell Williams and Travis Scott. Once again, he shows up on this record twice, which honestly, I feel this is like one of the better, catchier songs on here. It's definitely a much more silly song, but it's one that I really found to enjoy. Not only does it, once again, have a really good Kid Cudi verse on there, but it definitely has a better Travis Scott verse than what we heard earlier on Get Off Me. And I genuinely did like the simple hook that Pharrell Williams provides on this track, despite him sort of sounding like the little brain thing from Little Diggy's Pillow Talking song. Once again, it is a much more silly song, but it's catchy. It has two really great verses. So yeah, it's a track that I did find myself enjoying quite a lot. Which once again gets ruined with the following track, Mr. Kula. Which was the track that I was actually pretty curious about when I first saw the track list reveal before the album itself dropped. I was actually talking to a friend. We both were discussing the INSANO album and just discussing, which tracks we're sort of more curious about. And I said, who the hell is Mr. Kula? I am actually wondering now. And after hearing the Mr. Kula track, all I gotta say is I found out who Mr. Kula is. And honestly, I wish I didn't find out who Mr. Kula is. In fact, I want to go the rest of my life just forgetting that I figured out who Mr. Kula is. So yeah, we'll just leave it at that. We then get a few decent tracks with Freshie and Tortured, with Freshie having surprisingly some of the best lyricism that I've heard from Cudi in a while, and probably the best lyricism from Cudi on this entire record in my opinion. And then it follows up with Tortured, which is one of the few sad tracks on the record, which is quite enjoyable as well. After that, we get another sad track called X and Cud, which includes a posthumous unreleased verse from XXXTentacion, which, by the way, before I say anything else, I find it really incredible that it is now 2024 and we are still getting some unreleased stuff from X that we haven't heard before. But that being said, his verse on here is just so short and he just really doesn't have a big influence or just a big part of the overall track itself, that it just seems a bit unnecessary to include X. And I'm starting to see that a lot of these artists lately that I've been including, like these unreleased X verses, just haven't really been doing him justice, where they just don't include him that much in the track. Or, at the very least, like have him in the chorus the way Lil Wayne did in the Carter 5 on the track Don't Cry. You know, there has been just a lot of really disappointing X verses, and it's mostly because they're sort of wasted on these tracks that don't really do him justice anymore. So even though I really did enjoy the overall vibe that Cudi provided on this X and Cut track, it just once again just proves to be another sort of waste of an X verse that at this point is just really heartbreaking to see. At this point, we are now towards the end of the album, which oddly enough has some of the better tracks of the entire record, despite a few minor hiccups with the tracks Porch Topless and Hit the Streets in My Nikes. But despite those two minor hiccups, I would say we do go on a sort of decent winning streak, starting with the track 7, which has a verse with Lil Wayne, which honestly, I think it's really crazy to think that this is the first time we hear Cudi and Lil Wayne on a track together, because these two genuinely have some really great chemistry on this track. They both like work with each other very well. Um, it just genuinely sounds like a classic Lil Wayne and Kid Cudi verse that you would hear back in the early days when they both were starting out. So yeah, once again, it's really, really crazy to think that this is the first time we hear them work together. But honestly, I would say it was definitely worth the wait, considering that we've had some pretty bad Wayne verses recently, but this one is definitely like a better one from him. And once again, he works really well with Cudi. So yeah, 7 is a really, really great track, which is later followed up with Funky Wizard Smoke. Which was a track I really wasn't expecting like great things from because of the title itself. But this ended up being the second track on here that not only has the most unique production out of the entire record, but it definitely has some pretty great lyrics from Cudi himself as well. The following track, Rager Boys, however, is probably the most like surprising one on this entire record for me, because it includes the best verse that I've ever heard from Young Thug, who is an MC that I usually am not too excited to hear from whenever I see him on a feature. I genuinely have not enjoyed any single verse that I've heard from this man, but honestly, I really enjoyed his verse on here. I think he did the entire song justice, and he did, like Cudi style justice as well. So yeah, a really pleasant surprise to hear a really great verse from Young Thug on Rager Boys. And finally, we got the track Blue Sky, which sounds like a classic Kid Cudi track with some of Cudi's best vocals on the entire album. And I should also mention that the track 7 and Rager Boys have some really great vocals from Kid Cudi as well. Which is the reason why those two tracks are really enjoyable to me as well. Despite the better tracks being towards the end of the album for me, I still am not sure if it justifies me having to sit through mid to okay tracks in the beginning of this album. And I usually don't mind when tracks are a little over an hour long like Insano is, but in Kid Cudi's case, I think Insano would have benefited from being a bit shorter, because a lot of the tracks on here just seem a little bit too dragged out and once again just feel like throwaways, and it's really hard to enjoy the majority of the record. Despite once again having really like decent tracks on here, the majority of it just really doesn't make worth sort of listening to the better tracks on here. But the biggest downfall that this record has for me is the fact that Cudi is sort of relying on the production to carry the album. And while the production itself is one of the biggest highlights, one of the most enjoyable parts of this album, a lot of it is pretty impressive, not gonna lie, but some of it just sounds a bit too repetitive, and it just gets really old really quickly. It's something I've noticed in a lot of new music lately, where it seems that unfortunately what's been more prioritized with new records has been the production and not the actual lyrics or message itself. You know, back when I used to listen to new albums when I was a teenager, I would definitely look forward to the message. What is the artist telling me? What is the artist making me feel? Hell, what is the artist like teaching me? I just love the overall message, and it's something I always took away. And at that point, the production was just a really like great bonus to have, where it doesn't really overpower the artist, but it instead complements the artist's overall message. And it's really heartbreaking to see someone like Kid Cudi, a man that really made us feel the emotion and pain in his voice and in his lyrics, back when he first started out with not only a kid named Cudi, but with the very first Man on the Moon record as well. It's really sad that we go from that to now this album where Cudi has now sort of like downplayed to letting the production overpower him, and like, hoping that the production carries the album. Like I said, the production on here isn't bad. It genuinely is pretty impressive, despite some of it being a bit repetitive, but it just really isn't what I would consider what a Kid Cudi album should sound like. But at the end of the day, considering how atrocious that Flex preview was, I do think this album could have turned out a lot worse than we all expected. But that being said, it's not an album I would put next to the Man on the Moon series, but it is an album that I would put above Indicud and Speeding Bullet to Heaven. So, in other words, it's not Cudi's best work, and it's not even his worst work, I would say. It's just an album that exists, and I'll just leave it at that. So, with that being said, I'm thinking about a 5 out of 10 on this album. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review. What did you think about this album? Have you heard it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What are your favorite tracks? What are your least favorite tracks? Please let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear your opinion. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe down below if you would like some more. And don't forget to stay happy.